I love chase view rail shooters. In fact, they may well be one of my favorite genres of all time. What with me considering Space Harrier to be the greatest game ever made and all that. However, it is a surprisingly difficult genre to actually discuss. A large part of this is the fact the term rail shooter applies to a number of different genres, like light gun games and the first-person move the crosshair around the screen gunnery games. On top of the fact that when you look at it, games like Road Blaster or Mach Rider, where you're driving a car or a motorcycle and shooting, could kinda sorta be considered rail shooters as well in a way, and I'm still not sure if I would really count them or not, though I do enjoy them. It doesn't help that the genre is so ill-defined, and another part of that is the fact that, well, nothing actually admits to being a rail shooter. When a fighting game comes out, it says, this is a fighting game. When a beat-em-up comes out, it calls itself a beat-em-up. When a shooter comes out, it calls itself a shooter. But an on-rails shooter, chase view shooter, they never really have a really definite name. They'll call themselves 3D shooting games, or arcade shoot-em-ups, or arcade flight simulators, or just arcade action. No one really says, I'm an on-rails shooter. And another part of that is the fact the term on-rails kind of has negative connotations, especially after the term free-roaming became such a buzzword. On-rails is the polar opposite of free-roaming, after all. And so, when everyone was going on and on about free-roaming games, yeah, games would be considered bad if they were on-rails. Being an on-rails game was a bad thing. In fact, one of the most glaring examples of this was IGN's review of Star Fox Assault, where they actually bashed the game because it had on-rails stages, claiming that they were outdated. Then, in the very next paragraph, they complained about the fact that the off-rails stages that made up the majority of the game weren't as good as the on-rails stages. Further complicating matters is the fact that a good rail shooter doesn't let you know that you're on rails. They keep the action right in front of you, right in your face, with tons of stuff constantly flying at you, so that way you never feel the need to try to turn around or go off the beaten path. All the action is straight ahead. And with a little bit of camera movement and real control of your path, it doesn't feel like you're on rails at all. You would be shocked how many people are completely oblivious to the fact that Star Fox 64 is a rail shooter. Seriously, there's a number of people who don't know that. As such, the opposite happens sometimes too. Sometimes there are off-rails shooters that feel a lot like an on-rails shooter, even though they're actually off-rails. A good example of this is Omega Boost. You would be surprised how many people think Omega Boost is a rail shooter, and no, it really isn't, with the exception of one stage. It's like stage 4 or 5 is on rails, but the rest of Omega Boost is actually an off-rails shooter. It just feels a lot like Panzer Dragoon with a little bit of Space Harrier, in spite of it being off-rails, and it is a really good game, but it's actually not a rail shooter. Which does raise a question, though. Why is it that I like on-rail shooters? Wouldn't these games be better if they were off-rails? Well, these games are in 3D, and I think the best way to explain why this isn't the case is to remove a dimension. Let's look at them in 2D. What would be the 2D equivalent of an on-rail shooter? Well, that would be your traditional horizontal and vertical scrolling shooters. Think about it. You're constantly moving forward along a set path, shooting at the enemies that are thrown at you. So what's the 2D equivalent of an off-rails shooter? Well, that would be Time Pilot. Think about it. You can move freely around the stage. You could go backwards. You could kind of consider Fantasy Zone and Defender to be off-rails 2D shooters as well. And again, look at the horizontal and vertical scrolling shooters. You can't turn left or right. You can't turn around and go backwards. You are set on that path that is constantly scrolling forwards. But in Time Pilot, yeah, you can fly around freely. That is a 2D off-rails shooter. Now, would I say that Time Pilot is better than Raiden or Star Soldier, Soldier Blade, R-Type, Gradius, Xevious? No. I'd say it's different. I wouldn't really say that Gradius and Xevious and R-Type and all that are really better than Time Pilot either. The two genres are so distinctly different from one another that they kinda can't be compared. I feel it's the same thing with on-rails and off-rails 3D shooters. When you really look at it, the all-range mode sections in Star Fox, they're a lot like a 3D Time Pilot. And the on-rails sections, they're kinda like a 3D, Gradius or R-Type. I think they're a little closer to R-Type. So, yeah, that's what it is. That's exactly why I love it. When you really look at it, rail shooters are just shoot-em-ups like Gradius or Raiden. You move up, down, left, right around the screen, dodging enemy projectiles and shooting at enemies and blowing them up. It's technically, on paper, the same genre, but in practice, it feels completely different. But at the same time, wouldn't you say horizontal and vertical scrolling shooters feel different? It's really weird, like, those two are even more, like, blatantly similar on paper, and yet horizontal scrolling and vertical scrolling shooters feel distinctly different. And the same way, 3D chase view rail shooters, or forward scrolling shooters, or whatever you want to call them, those also feel different. But what are these differences? Well, the biggest one would have to be the stages. You see, in a horizontal and vertical scrolling shooter, much of the stage is just a background, with only a few little pieces that might maybe protrude into the foreground. But it's not uncommon that the background is literally just window dressing. That is just behind you. It almost doesn't matter what's behind you in those games. However, in a rail shooter, the stage is all around you, in front of you, to your left, to your right. You are literally in the stage, flying through it. And as such, it's not uncommon that the stage interacts more with the game. You know, it's more tangible. You're actively dodging obstacles and going to specific places. Another difference, though, kind of brings up an unusual issue. When you really look at horizontal and vertical scrolling shooters, a lot of the gameplay movement is actually one-dimensional. In a horizontal scroller, what really matters is moving up and down more than left and right, and vice versa for vertical scrollers. Oftentimes, if you were glued to the bottom of the screen, or back of the screen, it really wouldn't matter all that much. The majority of the dodging and shooting is one-dimensional. Yes, there are times when you need to move forwards and backwards. I'm not saying it's completely one-dimensional, but the majority of it is. This is completely changed with a chase view rail shooter, wherein you are constantly moving up, down, left, and right. The gameplay is actually two-dimensional. Yeah, you can't really move forwards and definitely not backwards at all, but yeah, there are games where you can speed up and slow down, but yeah, generally speaking, you can't move forwards and back much, but you can move around in 2D. This actually creates some unusual issues because there's almost too much space compared to a regular shoot-'em-up. You have too much room to dodge enemy projectiles, but worse yet, that means there's too much space that the enemies can hide from your shots. It is strikingly difficult to actually shoot an enemy in a chase view rail shooter if it's not handled well. Now, my favorite way of handling this is, of course, the Space Harrier way. You just make your bullets bigger and the enemy hitbox is nice and large, so that way it fills up that extra space and you can hit them. This, I feel, is the ideal way to handle things. You could also give your ship like a spread shot, have it shoot multiple guns, or put a little bit of homing on its regular guns. However, there's another solution that I'm not nearly as big a fan of, and that would be homing weapons, which I see a lot of in this genre. Now look, I love locking onto a bunch of enemies and unleashing this huge swarm of homing missiles or lasers and watching them shoot out and hit things. It looks awesome, it feels awesome, it makes you feel super powerful. However, there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. And there's a number of games where your regular guns are nearly useless or made completely obsolete by the homing weaponry. If all you do in the entire game is just lock on to enemies, unleash homing shots, rinse and repeat, well, it starts to get kinda old and it really detaches you from the action. You see, when you shoot your regular forward guns that you normally have, it's immediate and far more visceral. You push the button, the bullet flies out super fast, it hits the enemy, they blow up. You really feel it. However, when it comes to homing shots, you lock onto the enemy by holding down the button, lock onto a whole bunch of them, you release the missiles fly out, they chase after the enemy, and then they hit them. There's this huge delay between when you marked the enemy to be shot and when it actually gets shot, and you only really need to get near that enemy once. As you're flying around and maneuvering, you can be, like, far, far away from the enemies that you're blowing up, and you just aren't feeling it. It's not nearly as visceral. Now, I'm not going to count this against rail shooters too terribly much. I mean, so much of the genre relies on this, but I do feel that a game is better when it doesn't rely entirely on homing weapons. When the homing weapons are limited or a bonus and there's some restriction, as long as your regular forward shot has some kind of purpose, I do feel that makes the game better. Again, mostly homing weapon-based games aren't bad, though. Basically, what I'm saying is I vastly prefer Space Harrier over Afterburner and Star Fox over Panzer Dragoon, but to each their own. So, why do I like rail shooters so much? Well, the term is ridiculously overused. It's been driven completely into the ground. But this is the one time where I will actually say I feel they're more immersive than the average shoot-'em-up. And the reason for that is because, again, you are flying literally into and through the stage. The stage surrounds you. So you have a better sense of place and location and being somewhere. I do appreciate that. There's also the fact that rail shooters can have a much greater sense of speed than vertical or horizontal scrolling shooters. Yeah, they can go fast, but you don't feel it the same way that you can feel it in a rail shooter. These things can just whiz by you. I love a feeling of speed. I love a good sense of speed. In fact, to be honest, I think the best kind of game is going really fast and blowing things up, and that's one of the kinds of things that rail shooters can provide. However, even if the game isn't fast, there's still just something about flying through these stages. Also, some rail shooters have this interesting inertia programmed into it. You can really feel it with Star Fox, where it actually makes you feel like you're flying something. You're really moving around. The reason I like them more than off-rail shooters, though, is, well, in a lot of off-rail shooters, you spend more time looking for the enemy and not enough time actually shooting at the enemy. They're often far off in the distance and you're constantly spinning around, desperately trying to locate them. You know, you just aren't feeling it, and sometimes you can even get a little bit lost if the environment isn't just completely empty. However, in a chase view rail shooter, you don't have to look for the enemies. They're thrown right at you, right in front of your face, usually at a very high speed to keep you occupied and engaged with the game as you're flying through the environment. There's no way to get lost, no question about what you need to do. Just go straight ahead and blow things up. I also like, well, they do a really good job of making you feel awesome, even if you suck at the game. The sense of speed, the environment you're flying through, everything about them can really just make you feel great. It makes you feel like you're way cooler than you actually are, which is kind of a recurring theme in video games. It's something a lot of people like about video games. Enough of a rail shooter's awesomeness is automated that nearly anyone can feel super cool. However, the game doesn't play itself. There's enough interactivity and challenge and stuff you're doing that you don't sit there and go, oh wait, I'm not really playing this game. No, you're still in there. You're still flying that ship. You just, yeah, you're dodging enemy projectiles. You're shooting at them. You're trying not to run into obstacles and stuff. You are still as engaged with a rail shooter as you would be with a horizontal or vertical scrolling shooter. You still feel awesome, but you don't have to worry as much about navigating and finding enemies, all the things that I just mentioned. So, having said all that, you might have noticed that rail shooters aren't really all that common of a genre. I mean, yeah, there's rail shooter stages in a lot of games, but we're talking about single stages rather than entire games built around that mechanic. As such, it can be difficult to find more, especially as so many just slipped under the radar throughout the years. I mean, oh look, it's yet another spaceship shooter. Who cares back then? But nowadays, you know, rail shooters, they're pretty friggin' rare. Their main purpose when the genre was first invented was to be a tech demo, to show the cool things this hardware could do. And it was one of the only kinds of 3D games you could make without polygons and technically without sprite scaling. There's a number of them that find a way to just draw the same sprite at different sizes and use that to simulate the effect of getting near something. And a rail shooter is one of the only 3D genres where you don't need to see the back or sides of an object. You only need to see it from the front. As such, yeah, it was one of the only kinds of 3D games you could have in the era before polygons. However, now that we have polygons, now that we can make off-rail shooters, now that graphics have far surpassed anything we would need to hide in a rail shooter, well, the genre's nearly vanished. It's really hard to find, and even back in the past, it was incredibly uncommon. Looking at it, there were generally like 5 rail shooters per system if you were lucky. There's a few that have over 10, but most of them, it's not unsurprising to only see 1 or 2 on a system. Now, while 5 or 10 rail shooters per system may sound like a decent number, I want you to think about the sheer number of fighting games, beat-em-ups, literally any other genre, puzzle games, shoot-em-ups, platformers. Think about the sheer number of those on every console you've played. There's probably like 50, 100 of those per console. And rail shooters, a paltry 5, 10 if you're lucky. It's a really uncommon genre, and I think some of that is that people just haven't really come together to appreciate it. You can even see that within the genre itself. Many of the lesser-known rail shooters seem to be trying to copy the style of either Star Fox or Panzer Dragoon or Space Harrier or Afterburner. You don't really see them mix these two terribly much, consider them the same genre, really build on that. And I think that's a bit of a shame. I would love to see it if this genre could evolve. Again, the fact that I actually said that this is a type of shoot-em-up? This is a shmup? I mean, that surprises people. There are people who will vehemently disagree with this. I just don't feel the genre has really reached its pinnacle. And again, they're so hard to find. So many have slipped under the radar. Because so many people just haven't cared. So that's why I've decided to create the Rail Shooter Archive. Basically, I've created a WordPress blog, and I've made a placeholder entry for every single friggin' rail shooter that I can think of. Chase view only. Every single one I can think of, I put up some kind of placeholder entry listed by system with separate categories for the classics and the ones that really should be classics, as well as a section for all the ones I complete videos of. Because yes, right now all you have is a list of what I know about and maybe some dumb sentence or two that I wrote. But the goal is to sit down, get and play as many of these as possible and make short, like 5, maybe 10-minute videos talking about each of them in order to greater discuss and spread the word of rail shooters. What's the point of all this? Well, when you make a big old list of things, you're going to get a bunch of people going, oh, hey, did you know about this rail shooter or this rail shooter? Hey, is this a rail shooter? So in that way, I'm going to find more rail shooters thanks to other people. On the flip side, by making this huge comprehensive list, anyone who wants to look into the rail shooter genre, play more of them, because I know there's fans out there, well, now they'll have some place to start. As it is, I've found nearly 100 different rail shooters that you can look into and try. And by collecting all these together, we can have a better look at the genre as a whole, and perhaps get ideas as to how to better improve the genre, perhaps inspire a few indie developers to try their hand at making an entry with greater knowledge of what has worked and doesn't work in the past, what makes a really good rail shooter, and what makes a so-so rail shooter. And at the same time, maybe we can break the stigma of the chase view rail shooter. Maybe we could get some popularity and bring the genre back in some bizarre way. Or not. Either way, I see a whole lot more rail shooters on all of our horizons, whether they're old or new. Anyway, this is Gel, and you've been GameBabble, and welcome to the Rail Shooter Archives. See ya.